The Epstein files are coming. Congress passed the law that basically changes everything and forces the Trump administration, the DOJ, to turn over a ton of materials. You can always subscribe here for my YouTubes and legal breakdowns. This is part 2 of a breakdown I've been doing about those documents. You can always find part 1 in the description, but part 2, I'm going to go into 2 of the document types they've requested. The Internal Justice Department communications, which affects the Trump administration and those in the past, and the circumstances of Epstein's death. There are, according to my count, about 5 categories of these types of documents, and that matters because in the law, they're enumerated. So you could imagine a scenario where the DOJ tries to fight some of them in the political environment right now, given the huge rebuke that Trump just lost. It is probably a bad idea in politics, let alone law, for them to say, hey, you get nothing. You could imagine a judge going, well, no, the DOJ is supposed to enforce the law, not violate it. Federal law, as of this new law that Trump signed, requires this material. But within it, there can be exceptions. And there are exceptions I think people would all agree upon. For example, something involving, hey, here's the document, but we've redacted the parts about a child or a minor. I don't think that would violate the spirit of the law, although depending on the redaction, sometimes they say, well, if it's pages and pages, are they lying? And for people who are cynical or skeptical, I think there's both out there. This is not the first rodeo. There have been huge clashes between the executive and Congress, including presidents who tried to sneak around and hide over big issues. It was an issue in the Nixon era. He ultimately lost. It was an issue with Reagan and Iran-Contra. It was an issue with the 9/11 Commission, where they did get a lot of material, but huge sections of material regarding some foreign dealings, what was believed to be the history of the relationship with the Saudis, stayed redacted. So basically, you can look at this as a fight where there is precedent on the side of Congress getting this info, and some precedent on the other side. I think there are some differences, and I'll get into that, but let's go into these categories. Internal DOJ communications is kind of a gold mine for whether there was a cover-up. You might say, well, it seems like there's a cover-up. I mean, I've noticed on South Park and late night jokes, that's kind of the punchline. Obviously, it looks like a cover-up. But I don't mean it in the general sense that Trump has lied about these issues. He has. Or that Pam Bondi has reversed herself, meaning she either was lying when she said she had the client list, or she was lying when she said she didn't. You don't need to be an investigative journalist to know that 2 opposite things cannot be true. So one of them was false, and given how much time she had to get her story straight, probably a lie. Not that she was confused, like someone handed her a file that said client list, and she just never looked at it and didn't know she was lying. Unlikely if we were even being fair. So the DOJ communications, though, could show, for example, whether there's material that doesn't prejudice an investigation but can be released. And if you're thinking, well, why would they ever release stuff that is bad for them? There are a lot of reasons. There's what's called Freedom of Information Act requests. There's what I mentioned in those other history where the government does have to turn something over because otherwise they would be breaking the law, and there could be sanctions for that. Or a judge makes them turn it over. Or a judge orders custodians to turn it over, meaning you don't just ask the person who wrote the email, hey, give us all your emails. Sometimes you go to the telecommunications provider or other people in the government. So there's a whole rich amount of detail here. Some of it gets pretty technical and dry about how this works, but if you got in that goldmine, you might see people emailing back and forth with the leadership, the Attorney General, or Todd Blanche, the deputy who did this very controversial, misleading interview with Maxwell Epstein's co-conspirator. You might see other people in DOJ talking about it without them on the chain, like they did something, let's say, bad. And then other people in DOJ are concerned about it and saying, should we blow the whistle? Should we tell the watchdog? This seems wrong. Why are we firing the lead prosecutor on this case, Maureen Comey, when she was successful in getting justice for the victims? One of the only prosecutors doing that, and maybe you find out in the emails, I'm just hypothetical, that there was a reasonable explanation that it didn't have to do with Epstein. And you might say, as far as the Congress is concerned, okay, we have that. Or you might find something suspicious. That's just for the current Trump era. Then you go back to the prior Biden administration. And there's a big question here that haunts the Democrats who've made such a big deal out of this, even if you think they've gotten to a good result. And a lot of people have said Ro Khanna, who was the lead sponsor on the bill, was joined by Massey, a Republican. They got action. But wouldn't it have been easier to get that action when their party controlled the White House and DOJ? Why not go to Merrick Garland over the 4 years and get those materials? I recently actually asked Congressman Khanna about that, and he said, on the one hand, yes, fair question, fair to look back and say they should have done more with urgency. And two, he said it was a long process. And he went through his defenses of how, basically, he said that they were looking at getting that, some of it was slowed down by a judge, etc. Then you go back further to the first Trump term, and those DOJ communications could look back at, say, Alex Acosta, who Trump promoted, but was part of the original sweetheart deal that cut out victims, ultimately unlawfully, and helped Epstein and had this sort of very lenient house arrest type thing in Florida. So you could look back at whether there's communications about that, who knew about that, was there any meddling? Again, I'm ripping off all these, like rifling off all these questions. But these are things that you would look at in those documents. The next part that would matter for the DOJ under Biden, and the next topic is Epstein's death. So that's the final category. If you remember, I've gone through several of these over 2 videos. The fifth and final category is material about Epstein's death. Point number 1 on this, it's not true that every time there's a suspicious death, it was actually foul play or conspiracy. Sometimes in life, you have situations that are just suspicious, and that's what journalists or serious investigators do. They don't come in saying, oh, we want to find the most exciting or nefarious explanation. They say, let's look at the facts. When you look at the facts over time, the Epstein death looks more suspicious, not less, over time. The reasons are another individual who was directly tied to Epstein-Brunel also committed suicide, according to the authorities in a French cell. The new emails we got just within the last few weeks show they were talking about transporting, quote, girls. So that's more of a link operationally than was publicly known. And you have a lot of questions about the aftermath of the death, and anyone watching this online, you've probably seen some of these questions. I'm not breaking news here. You go, okay, let's go look at what happened. Oh, the video is missing. Okay, let's talk to people. Oh, people were less than candid at the prison. Why? Are they hiding something that they messed up? Doesn't mean, by the way, the worst case scenario, but why are they being less than candid? I say that because under the Biden era, they completed a watchdog investigation in the Office of Inspector General. Biden and Merrick Garland were in charge of the DOJ at the time, and that's a lengthy report that has a lot of questions in it. It says some of the guards weren't candid, the videos were mishandled, people know that, and doesn't necessarily reveal whether they did a fuller criminal investigation. For example, using the powers of criminal subpoenas, which are the stronger tools than just talking to people, for example, and checking what you'd want to know if you were looking into foul play. Did you check the guards' bank accounts and crypto and that of their families? Did you really do a full search to see whether, in the years after, anything suspicious suggested an effort from the outside to get into that prison? These are questions. I'm not telling you any of that's been confirmed, but to get back to Category 5, a real investigation, which Congress is finally putting the teeth behind, would look at whether the Biden-era review of that did that. You might say, well, wait. Attorney General Garland oversaw the first ever indictment of a former president. He didn't seem afraid of bad stuff about Trump. But the reason why you don't usually trust the government to investigate itself is that it's not all simple partisan. Sometimes the government just doesn't want to deal with things that make it look bad. We've certainly seen that in national security probes where you have 9/11 and everyone goes, well, let's focus on the enemies. Duh, you do focus on the enemies. We had wars over it. But the review internally of, wait, did we know everything we could? Could this have been prevented? Should anyone in our government be held accountable? History is full of examples where both parties, the people in power, they just don't want to get into that. And I don't say that as like, oh, some new conspiracy theory. That's actually what history shows. And so one of the questions that Congress can look at is, in the documents and the investigation of the death, was it a thorough investigation that went wherever it went? Or did it seem to have a ceiling like, let's get this Inspector General report done and move on, not because they're trying to, quote, help Trump? I don't think people think that's what Merrick Garland's goal was, but because it involved the ongoing apparatus of the DOJ, the Bureau of Prisons, a lot of people up and down the line. And so if it was just a matter of, say, a mistake, the guy shouldn't have been left alone, and they lost the tapes, and let's say there was no foul play, but a bunch of government people made mistakes they don't want to deal with. Maybe that's where they left it. You can think of other examples in history, the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, where lower-level people sort of got disciplined, but nobody at really high level did. So I make that comparison to say, until you get a full accounting of this, investigative with independent views and not sort of trying to land on a certain outcome, you won't know. So that's why the Epstein death documents are important. I'll just add a little context from a legal perspective. Suicides are rare. Suicides in federal prison are fairly rare, and findings of killings are fairly rare. If you look at the numbers, just to give a context of the many, many tens of thousands of individuals in various levels of federal prisons, you average out to under 20 a year. So if you take a step back, both things are rare. If there was no foul play and this high-profile detainee was allowed to take his life, that's rare, and still reflects some failure of the prison to prevent that. They are not supposed to allow people in custody awaiting trial to just end their life. There's actually safety rules to try to prevent that. Remember, the person's in the government's custody, and this defendant hadn't been convicted yet. If there was foul play, and I can give you the most prominent example everyone remembers from any old Boston mob movies, is Whitey Bulger. Long history there, gangster, informant, convicted, put into prison. Everybody knows that Whitey Bulger, having been proven to be, among other things, an informant, is going to face risk in federal prison. And what happened? I bet you remember, because if you're watching my legal breakdown video, you're probably interested in this stuff. He was beaten to a pulp to death. That was an example where the feds weren't supposed to allow that. And then there were all these questions. Was it just a mistake? Still bad, because you have control of the person. You're not supposed to let them get killed. That's a new crime the government just allowed, basically by omission or commission, but it allowed it. Or was it worse? Did somebody say, let's let this happen? Which is, if you do that, if you work in the government and you let that happen, you're an accessory to murder. So Whitey Bulger, who was well known to have this risk, still got off in prison. And so these are the kind of things you look at and you say, okay, does that happen all the time? No, it's very rare, but it can happen. And then you add the other questions swirling around Epstein and Maxwell, and the strange way that he seemed to get away with a lot seemed to talk about blackmail. If you look at the Trump cabinet, I've mentioned we have a cabinet officer who says there's blackmail. Pam Bondi says there wasn't in her written memo. Then you have more emails we've now seen. That's kind of essentially the beginning of the Epstein files. And when you read them, you see someone who thinks he can blackmail. That's not proof that it all happened, but he's literally emailing about he's got stuff on Trump and he can end the career and Trump wakes up sweating at night. So this is, again, adding to the storyline or the evidence of someone who at least tried to blackmail, and that adds to what, of course, investigators call motive. Would there be motive for someone on the other end of that to pursue foul play? Any of this that sounds like, well, we're down the rabbit hole. We're in the conspiracy theory. I'll tell you this. The week that this all happened, without all the evidence that's since come to light, it might sound like that. But we're in a very different place now, including legally a almost unanimous Congress, all but one vote in both houses, for getting the death documents. I asked Ro Khanna, who was behind the bill, whether that meant that they thought there was foul play. He was very careful. He said, doesn't mean we know, but there are questions and we want to get real answers based on evidence. So what in week one might have sounded like a lot now is the consensus position signed by President Trump under U.S. law, that they need those answers. All right, that's a breakdown of a bunch of stuff. Again, I'm here. I did it off top. So thanks for bearing with me. You can always subscribe to my videos here on YouTube and stay informed.